Hello and welcome to week 2 of Information Sources and Services. I want to thank you all for recording your introductions on VoiceThread. I think there's still one or two I haven't seen, but it was really nice seeing you, and I think we'll use VoiceThread on and off throughout the semester unless anybody has any real objections. We don't always have to record our visual, but we can record voices, and at least we feel like we're talking to each other. We'll stick with the discussion board this week, and then maybe next week we'll go back and try another voice thread. This week we're going to talk about, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to reference and a history of reference services. So Harper in the chapters, and let me just say this about the book, I mentioned that I don't remember if I mentioned in the lecture or just in the syllabus that I usually use Harper. It's not available, so I'm going to be copying the chapters and putting them up, not something I would normally do, but since the book's not available, I feel that we're not breaking copyright then. So I'm going to be getting those done as the weeks go on. I may not have those ahead. You can see a lot of the other materials posted ahead, but I will probably be posting those. I have to get them copied and get this to post them up, so it may take me till the night before to get everything posted. I'll try to get it done a little ahead of time, but please be patient with me on that. And remember, I am saving you $75. That's what that book costs. So Harper does a nice job of detailing milestones in library history in her first chapter. There's just a few more that I wanted to mention here. One of my research interests is library history, and matter of fact, my dissertation was on a library in Newark. The Newark Public Library, and you'll often hear me when I'm talking historically refer to the Newark Public Library, since I did some in-depth research, some of it on microfiche. We talked about microfiche in the discussion board this week, at Newark Public Library. So in 1740, Ben Franklin noted that school library was a key element in what he considered an ideal academy, and I wish that people would continue to listen to him as they do about other things as one of our founders of our country. In the 1744 in the Penn Charter School, there was a room actually designated for the library. The first free public library was opened in Peterborough, New Hampshire. It's the first library that was tax supported and free and open to the public. Sometimes you'll see people point back to Ben Franklin as having some of the first public libraries. He had public reading rooms and member libraries where you actually had to pay to join the library. Peterborough, and then I think Boston Public is the second one that's noted, were actually funded by taxpayers and did not cost anything to join. So there's a difference between when you read about Ben Franklin's early libraries outside of the ones designated libraries in schools, and a free public library that's supported by taxpayers. In 1876, the American Library Association was founded, and AASL, which is our association, American Association of School Librarians, which is a chapter in American Library Association. They work through ALA, and while there wasn't, AASL came as ALA developed. They developed a school librarian section and finally a division, which is what AASL is. And then in 1887, Melville Dewey of the Dewey Decimal System opened the first library school at Columbia University. It was later moved to New York, and Columbia used to have a really good library school, and they closed it quite a few years ago, which seems a shame. It wasn't until 1890 to 1900, so you had libraries around. You see the first free public library in the 1830s. Not until the 1890s were children really given space in libraries. They were considered kind of a nuisance, and actually the reason that they were given space in public libraries was to keep them out of the adults' way. So a lot of times their spaces were in the basement. Sometimes they were off to the side, but they were given their own spaces and their own librarians because the adults didn't want to deal with the children, and they were kind of shunted off to the side so that the adults could be not bothered. And of course, librarians took that and ran with it, and now we have amazing services to children. And we had our first professionally trained school librarian in the 1900s, or in 1900. So school librarianship has only been around for about 117 years, as opposed to, well, librarianship's been around forever, and I'm sure we could expand the definition of school librarianship and say within academies that there were, sorry, turning off my phone here, making noise, that there were within universities and other places that could have been something that was a school librarian but not a professionally trained school librarian. So from the 1900s on, we got our first school librarian, and when children's librarians became normal in public libraries, there have been a lot of changes in technology and culture that have affected libraries. In the early part of the century, the 1900s, actually from the 1880s on, librarians focused on getting good books into the hands of all people and of children. And librarians actively worked to limit the reading of fiction unless the books were moral and demonstrated appropriate social norms. And it was interesting in doing research around, I looked at 1880 to 1920, that they would try all kinds of schemes to even prevent adults from taking out fiction and novels. You could take out one fiction book, but 2 nonfiction books, or you were limited to, you know, 1 fiction book per week or something. There were all of these schemes, and they even closed the stacks so that you couldn't get in, and originally all stacks were closed, and what you had to do was look up what you wanted and write a slip, give it to the librarian, and they would go into the libraries. They didn't want people browsing in the books. Eventually this changed, and for example, in Newark Public Library, they changed nonfiction over first. So people were allowed to go and browse in the nonfiction section, but they were not allowed to browse in the fiction section until they opened a new library in 1906, 1903. Their new building was built in Newark. And then they finally changed it over to novels, but they did whatever they could to discourage the reading of what they considered frivolous material. As Harper noted, there was an influx of money to libraries and especially to school libraries in the 1960s as part of the effort to spur scientific progress so that we could stay current with the Russians. Sputnik went up in space, so they got into space before America did, and so there was this money coming out of the government to increase education, especially in science and technology. More recently, we have the challenge of changing formats, although this has really begun much longer ago than we suspect. Actually, changing formats have been something, you know, originally we had, before the codex, which is the book form, there were scrolls. So it was a big change to go from stretching out a scroll and reading on a scroll to, you know, to turning the pages in a codex. And then, you know, there were different ways to store things, and we had microfiche, as some of you mentioned, as old-fashioned and maybe extinct, but that was a really cutting-edge technology when it was introduced and saved a lot of space in libraries and archives, and still allowed people to do things like somebody mentioned, looking up an obituary in an old newspaper. So it was useful at the time, and still exists in especially a lot of archives and research libraries. Now we have Google, and students want answers right away, but not everything can be found on Google. We're going to talk a little bit about Google and the deep web in one of our lectures, and certainly not everyone knows how to search, evaluate material, or choose the best source. So it's a good answer to why do we need librarians. There's, as some of you might know, some schools question, it's an easy place to cut. We'll cut the school librarian, and they eventually come to realize that it's not an easy place to cut, because you need the school librarian, you need somebody trained, and there's a lot of research that talks about the importance of the effect of having a well-supplied school library with a trained school librarian on test scores. And boggles my mind that with the emphasis on testing and increasing test scores, that they overlook this simple and important element in increasing test scores. And of course, while increasing test scores isn't necessarily the reason that we'd want to emphasize for having librarians, it certainly could be a justification for putting more money toward libraries and helping students become good readers and good researchers. And we certainly know about the need for knowing how to choose good formats after our latest election. So, types of reference. There's three broad types of reference. One is ready reference, which is basically quick answers to questions that don't require in-depth research. So it could be, how tall is the Eiffel Tower? What was Babe Ruth's batting average? What does a full-grown elephant weigh? So those are things that, a Google search actually is often very useful for there. But we're going to also talk about other types of print material that you can have on hand to answer those kinds of ready reference questions. And students need help learning where to go for those answers to those kinds of questions. Even though they seem really simple and you can look it up quickly, there is it could be wrong out there in some places. So it's good. One of the things we're going to talk about is what makes a good reference source. How do we evaluate our reference sources and teach students to do the same? And then, of course, research. Somebody mentioned that, one of the things they remember was having a librarian help them do research and find the good resources and send them in the right direction. So it is an important part of the job. How you do it depends on the age level of the student, how in depth you get. But one of the things that helping students with research often necessitates is a reference interview. And we're going to talk more about the reference interview in future classes, and that's going to be the basis of your first assignment that's due, your reference interview paper. So it's something that we will discuss a lot in terms of the reference transaction and the reference interview. Reader's advisory can be the most fun type of question, especially when it means helping find students a book that they really want to read, not just a book that fits requirements for a reading assignment, like a 100-page book or a biography or realistic fiction or a certain accelerated reading level. And actually, there's some interesting, if you've been looking at School Library Journal, or you can get updates from AASL, there's a really interesting column about reading levels. I think it's in School Library Journal that I read it, and how damaging they can be to readers. And I talk about that more in the children's literature class, but it's interesting because it's right now a topic that's being discussed by librarians. So finding something that piques a student's interest within limited requirements, such as reader's level, accelerated reader level, or all of the multiple different kinds of reading levels that there can actually be an exciting challenge. Sometimes it's impossible, but it's certainly we always want to find something that interests the reader, because what's been shown is that if a reader is interested in the topic, they're more willing to even struggle with material that's above their level because the interest is there in reading. The most common type of question at a reference desk is usually directional, which I haven't listed on here, and it's involves where is. In public libraries, it usually includes the restroom, the copier, the meeting room. Can even be where is fiction, where is nonfiction, where's the reference, where's the computer. So directional questions become a lot of times public libraries, and you may even want to do this in your library if you have a library where people are coming in and asking, or in, like maybe a high school library where you have students come in asking questions, is keep a log on your desk, and you can divide the types of questions you answer, and one of those columns should be directional, just so that they know. It's just good to, it's interesting to keep track of, and it takes up your time, so you might as well record it and report it. New Jersey used to have a homework helpline. I think Harper mentions these in her books, and it used to be one of the functions of the library, but the funding was cut and it's no longer available. Unfortunately, it was very useful for helping students when because it was open later in the evening, but it was another type of reference that could be done by helping with homework help, but it's not, and that would kind of come under research usually, but it's no longer available. So if you ever want to advocate for something on the state level, that's something that you could certainly do. I think it was, if it could be very useful to students. So Harper makes a distinction between reference work and reference transactions. We will turn to reference transactions, which I talked about with the reference interview as part of the reference transaction, and we'll talk about that more next week and further weeks. But reference work includes a broader array of responsibilities, including selecting materials, organizing those materials into for easy access, both in person and online. It includes information literacy, which can include everything from helping students find topics to research, finding the material on the topics, evaluating that material, and creating ways to share the information that's turned into knowledge. And we'll talk about that in a later in the semester. Some reference tools that are used during reference work include research guides or pathfinders and LibGuides, which you're going to be doing a LibGuide at the end of the semester, library catalogs, databases, websites. These are different elements of the tools that you can use to do different parts of your reference work. And we're going to be looking at one of the things we're going to be doing is looking at different kinds of reference materials, and we're going to be looking at information literacy, and we're going to be looking at some of these tools as we go through the semester. Wanted to talk a little bit about school and public library cooperation. There's evidence that schools and public libraries cooperated at the turn of the 19th to 20th centuries, and here I go back to Newark Public Library because it's an example I've researched. Starting in 1889 till at least 1919, Newark began having boxes of 40 to 50 books. So this was before schools had necessary libraries. So they would create their first, I think in 1889, they had 4 traveling libraries for elementary and grammar schools and 2 for high schools. And there'd be boxes of 40 to 50 books that went to a school. And then they would be in the school for a certain amount of time and then go on to the next school. Before they expanded this program, when they only had these 6 traveling boxes, it would be a certain number of weeks in one school and then go to another school. And then as the program continued, there were more and more of these boxes. The circulation increased hugely. Shouldn't even use that word. It increased a lot, and they actually would do special collections of books. So if school contacted the librarian and let them know that they were working on X project, then they would send books to do with that project to that school. And it increased in circulation through the 1910s. Today it can be really hard to get school public library cooperation, but it can be very useful. Um, it On both sides, the public and the school librarian, you don't always have time to work with each other, but it really can be useful. I think of when when I was in a public library, I'd get questions from students, and I wouldn't know what the assignment was, and it would be difficult. I was just looking to see if this is where. I'm sorry. So I would get an assignment, and one of the first reference questions I answered on my own on the desk as a public librarian, children's librarian, was this girl came in and said she needed information on EC no idea what that was. She had nothing recorded with it. She had no piece of paper from the school. We didn't have anything from the schools. She didn't know how to spell it. She didn't know what it was. She had no idea what it pertained to. We finally teased out a few clues. She remembered it had something to do with Japan. I pulled in the adult reference librarian, who had a lot more, we were a smaller library, so when there wasn't somebody on the desk for children's, the adult librarian had to cover, so she had been there quite a few years and had more experience, but even she was a little bit flummoxed. And we finally realized it was ISSEI and NESSEI, which has to do with first and second generation Japanese, and she was looking for information on the internment camps. So if I had had the assignment or a list of possible topics that they were going to look at for that particular thing, I would have helped her a lot. I would have been a lot more. I did find the information she needed eventually, but she had to wait a long time while we worked our way through it. So, so it's good to have cooperation with your public librarian if you possibly can. I know that it can be difficult to, even when you're in a school library, to get your teachers to tell you what's going on, but at least you have a little more luck because you're in the same building with them. But it can be useful if then you share that knowledge with your public librarians. One area that's kind of interesting is a recent trend, and it's an old trend coming back again, is combining school and public libraries in one place. Usually in the school they have the public library both in the same building, and or if the two are close, then they have the students travel from the school library to the public library, and that can be really tough. If it's in the school, then you have to worry about what's available to the students. That if you have kindergarten students coming in, you have to have an adult section, and that causes issues unless the students are limited to just one portion of the library. And a lot of times when if schools close down their school library and say, oh, they can just go to the public library, public librarians are not trained in quite the same way that a school librarian, that you guys are going to be trained to deal with certain issues and to understand what students need. So it's interesting. Another example of all library cooperation is the state has New Jersey State Library gets funding from the state, and with that funding they purchase databases that are available for school, public, and academic libraries in the state throughout New Jersey at no cost. Many of these databases are geared towards adults, but there are definitely some, one or two for the youngest children, middle school and high school. There's many more. So anybody who has a library card from a public library can access these databases, and you in your school library can have free access to them for your students. You need to contact the state library and find out from them how to provide access. They are trying to do geolocation so that when somebody signs in from a computer address that's located within the state, they automatically are able to access the databases, which makes it nice. But I've heard some issues, perhaps this, but now they've kind of smoothed them out. But there were some issues with the geolocation not working. But you certainly can work to get your students access to these databases, and it's kind of wasting money, sort of, if the schools are not using them, because they're out there and they're paid by the state, so everybody should really use them. One of the things you need to think about is developmentally appropriate reference, because different ages have different needs, and we're going to be looking at this a little bit more, but obviously you would not approach asking questions and providing resources to a second grader the same way you would to an 11th grader. So, and even within a group of second graders, there's different abilities in understanding, in using materials, and in what they need to, even in asking and answering questions. So you need to kind of keep that in mind when you're doing reference. Humor is important, but sarcasm is a big no-no always. You want to have a consistently open and welcoming attitude, and be aware of different cultures and how they view you as a librarian and how they view the library. If you think about here in the United States, most of us are aware of what a public library is, and that people can go in, and that there's a certain way we view public libraries, but not when students come from other cultures. They might not even know that such a thing is available, or that how they can use it. There may be different ways they approach authority figures. And so being open and welcoming, you need to recognize when, that they might not understand how to approach you, or understand how to use the library, or understand what the concept of the library is. And there's different, understanding the getting to know your students, and doing being aware of who you're serving within each of your individual libraries, because certainly a library, two libraries right now, two schools in the same district can serve completely different populations, and it's going to be important for you as a librarian providing reference to understand your students and to understand their needs. One advantage you have over the public library, there's public libraries, and librarians do a lot of surveys trying to figure out what their patrons want. And sometimes we survey the patrons that are coming in, but don't understand why the patrons that aren't coming in don't come in, and don't survey them. You have a captive audience, and you can get to know them because they're all within your school. So you have an advantage over public librarians. So we will discuss all of this more when we look at the reference transaction and the reference interview, but that's just a general thing to get you thinking about developmentally appropriate reference. And also with special needs, Harper talks about assistive technologies, additional resources, and a low-stress environment for all students. And adaptations can be beneficial to all students, and beneficial to students with different learning styles. So if you have multiple access points to the information, somebody who's a very visual learner may access information differently than somebody who's a very linear or tactile learner. So you just need to realize that having multiple access and having different assistant technologies can help. For example, there's many times I wish I had a screen magnifier. My eyes get very tired, and having a magnifier could be useful for all students, not just for the students who might have some visual impairment. And the software itself can help. All students should know how to use software to increase the size of what's on the screen so that they can read it more easily. Sometimes it's just the level of the student. If you notice, when we look at different databases as we go through the semester, the younger the database is indicated for, the bigger the font and the less um, text on a page. So that can be helpful for all of us. So sometimes I know I've looked at a page where it's just like, okay, way too much information, way too small font, way too much packed on there, and I would like something that would help me access it more easily. So when we think about special needs, these technologies are important for everyone. I mean, something as simple as being able to adjust your chair height, which I'm very short, so it's really important for me to be comfortable, because otherwise I sit there swinging my legs and putting a lot of stress on my back. And so a computer station that has an adjustable chair, especially if you have when I look at K through 8, the sizes of the students by the time they get to 8th grade, they're practically adult size, whereas kindergartners. So having a flexible places for them to sit and change what they change out how they sit and make themselves comfortable is important for everyone. New Jersey offers additional services to students with special needs. That's going to be part of your journal assignment. It's going to introduce you to that. So talk about that more in a minute. And when rearranging library spaces or developing new ones, make sure to hopefully your school will be consulting with somebody who is an expert to make sure that design works for everyone. I know that sometimes they don't even consult with the librarians to make sure that it's going to set up. I was reading somewhere, librarian was posting on some forum I was on, and they were saying that the library had been designed without her input, and they were going to put a slide in the middle of the library. And she was like, a slide? What am I going to do with that? And it was for part of the library was for older students, and they were going to put a loft which was out of view of the rest of the library. And she's thinking, this is just what high schoolers need, is a loft to disappear in. So obviously there was some not such good thinking going on with the design. So basically hopefully you can push for input if they decide to redesign your space. But Harper has some excellent tables of information and ways to assist students with resources for more information. The goal is to make information easier for all students to access, and teachers. That magnifying magnifier, or something that makes you hear it better, volume increaser, could work for all students and all teachers. I know I need the magnifier as I get older. So I just wanted to talk again about your reference journals. Your first one is due this week. We'll have one per week, although there may be a week or two that I give you a break. And you'll have a reference question to do. I'll post the reference question each week, and then you respond in your journal. It's private between you and I, and it's for practice. As I think I mentioned in the introductory lecture, practice makes perfect with this stuff, and I want to try and reinforce some of the things that we're covering each week by doing these practice reference questions that you might have when you're working in a school library. So these are due by the end of each week. So by midnight of our week is starting on Tuesday, so by midnight Monday, they should be posted. If you're having trouble, just, if that's a bad week, you have, 72 tests and the grades are due, and your cat threw up all over the place and you have to take it to the vet, or dogs, we seem to have a preponderance of dogs. Just please contact me and let me know. As long as I know something's going on and you're going to get back to it, then I'm fine. So but I do like to kind of get an idea that you're, just contact me. Email is great. I just wanted to mention the reference interview paper, which is going to be your first assignment. I posted the directions. I'm going to be refining the assignment a little bit before you start it. The basic what you need to do for the reference interview paper is you're going to be going out and asking a question a reference question at 2 different libraries without telling them that you are doing a project. So you will come up with a question that I will approve. You will go to 2 libraries. It can be 2 public libraries. It can be an academic library. You know, we can talk about the 2 libraries you're going to go to, and you're going to ask that question and evaluate. You're going to do observational research is basically what you're going to be doing. And analyze the data you collect, which is the 2 reference interviews. So one of the things that's not in the current directions is that in your research that you collect, you're going to have to do 1 qualitative, apologize for the typo there, 1 quantitative and 1 mixed methods paper that you, in your research. You're going to have to find 1 of each of these. And we're going to discuss what those things mean I'm going to give you a lecture that has just to do with the reference interview paper. But I just wanted to mention to you that I'm going to be making some small changes. The bulk of that assignment is going to be the same. There's going to be some adjustments in the way that you write it up. For those of you who are in schools, this has to do with accreditation, and I need to have it fit into certain boxes, and so it's still, I think you'll find it, most people who have done this find it a really fascinating assignment. So so that's it, and I will see you on the discussion boards.